Hello, and welcome back to What Now on the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. I'm here in the studio with my friends and colleagues.
Red Keating.
And David Kennedy.
I'm Julie Brown. Thank you for listening today. It's just the three of us today. It's been a while since it's just been the three of us. And we've had a big fall. We've been lucky to have all of our guests have been wonderful. We've covered several topics, and the three of us sat down a little while ago and came up with a list of some things that we haven't covered. And one of those ones we identified that we're going to speak about in this episode is anger and the role of anger in the grieving process, as well as during the palliative process as well.
The palliative process, I was thinking about that just recently, and I don't know if this will go back a little bit to that sense of guilt, but lots of people are angry at what the situation is presented, the situation they're presented with. Or they're angry at the person because maybe they feel there were some lifestyle choices that could have been made differently and we wouldn't be in this situation that we're in. And but you're not allowed to be angry at people who are palliative and dying. And so you have to hold on to it and carry it. And as we were talking about anger, I thought about that because I'm also thinking you don't speak poorly of the dead or you don't get upset at the dead. And I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I'm talking to people all the time who might have ashes still at home in an urn or something. They yell at them every day. I was just talking to a gentleman the other day and he says, he yells at his son almost every day. And this woman, her husband, she's just so mad at him. And she lets him know every day. She talks to the urn and lets him know that she's upset that he's left, that he's gone. And she lets him know it. And then they feel bad, and they feel bad that they are yelling at their loved one. And they want to make sure that that's okay. And I would say it probably is okay.
So I think that's probably our first place to begin in this episode, is to say anger is a part of the process. Mm-hmm. And I'm not referring to the stages of grief or anything like that, right? But just that anger is a human emotion. We all have that, even although many of us express it differently, many of us suppress our anger. But during a time of grief, whether that's, pre-death or post-death, a certain amount of anger for a period of time is a normal emotion that we see coming out.
I think it's an emotion that allows us to kind of generate and focus all of that stuff going on into. For me, I've often said that anger is like the fire alarm. It's not the fire. So it's what's going on outwardly, but it's fueled by something. It's not the actual fire itself. And I think that one of the things that I encourage people over time with anger is to try to ask some questions around, well, what is that anger really about? Mm-hmm. So when that person says, I'm angry because you left me, well, what's behind that statement there? What does that all mean? It means I'm here trying to figure it out on my own, or I feel like I'm abandoned.
That's
so
right.
Getting to those pieces behind the anger can be a helpful piece of what anger can lead us to.
Yeah, so in the therapy world, we often refer to anger as a secondary emotion. And what you're talking about there, David, is let's find out what the primary emotion is. So in other words, anger is often what we will exhibit. Sometimes we even feel safer feeling it or directing our anger of, yes, I'm angry that you've left me. And really what's sitting under there is this deep wound that's maybe been ripped open of abandonment, of sadness, of maybe even panic of being left alone. Well, wow, those are very uncomfortable, distressing, crisis-inducing at times feelings to feel. So we'll just package, we'll push that down, and anger's what's come up. And of course, none of that's conscious. It's not like you're deciding to do that. It's not like you're saying, I'm going to put my sadness aside and I'm just going to be angry in the world. It's more just anger can be productive for us. It's a way sometimes of our system saying those are really distressing feelings to be sitting in. And so the anger is what can be energizing and what can sometimes even keep us moving through the world.
Well, it can be more familiar. Right. I'm used to being angry. I've experienced anger probably more than I've experienced vulnerability. And did you say protective?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's protective.
So it becomes that armor that I can wear that keeps me from the vulnerability and the deeper feelings of sadness or loneliness that I might be feeling. And like you said, yeah, I can do something with it. What do I do with my loneliness but sit in it? But I can action anger. Anger is like a verb. I can action my anger. I can feel like I'm doing something with it.
And often the anger also is an expression of injustice. And it's the way in which we feel that we have been injured morally or some other way. And find anger is the way of that justification to deal with that injustice.
Yeah, I was thinking in preparation for this episode, I was thinking about some of the themes I hear about from my clients, and a really common place that anger is directed is at our systems, our healthcare system, our legal system, but in particularly healthcare. There's often quite a period of time, I find, more immediately after the death, in the weeks and first several months, where there's a lot of anger at doctors and nurses and the healthcare system and who fell through the cracks and who didn't do what. I find in many cases that eventually does ebb away, but there is a period of time, as you say, David, that injustice. And I sometimes think of that as a place to put the blame and a place to feel like we have some control. Like, something went wrong. My person has died. I don't have them anymore. There must be somewhere to blame, because death is so disorienting, right? It destabilizes us. So if things are destabilized, then something wrong must have happened. It couldn't be just that the person died because it was time for them to die, because we will all die. And so I do find that there is this natural period of wanting to figure out who is to blame. And then sometimes, there's these threats of, I'm going to make complaints and I'm going to write letters. And of course that does happen. Of course it does. And we've all heard those situations. But in many circumstances, I often hear that as part of the process. What about you guys?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
That sense of control.
Yes.
when all else has been turned upside down, when I'm trying to make sense of my life and I'm trying to get things back in order, something has gone wrong, and I know what I've done, and it wasn't me. So someone outside of me must be responsible for the pain I'm feeling right now, or putting me in the position that I'm in right now. And if only someone had done this, or if only someone had done that, or acted sooner, then I wouldn't be in this position. Therefore, my pain would be not present. I wouldn't be in pain. And so I need to find the root of that. And it isn't in me. It's outside of me, in whoever I can direct it toward. And I can blame them and feel like I've got some control back and some agency back in life. But then that can also act as a complete distraction.
That's right.
So I don't have to feel my vulnerability. I don't have to feel my pain. I can feel like I'm doing something.
That's the protective nature.
Yeah.
So it can be mobilizing.
So
it can be energizing.
And it gets reinforced. And so I keep doing it.
There have been situations, and I'm thinking of one where the anger was very present, and this person didn't feel they were in a place to be able to not just make sense of it, but to do anything about it. So in this case, it was a young person in their teens, and their father had died, and he was he wasn't that old, so he had lots of friends, and he was quite well known, quite well respected. This teenager was referred to me to see if I would talk to him because he had anger issues. That was all I knew, and that his father had died. But the story, when it came out, was that he was sitting in the front row at the funeral, and all of these people, one after the other, stood up and talked about how wonderful this man was and how kind and loving, et cetera, et cetera. And this young man was just sitting there. And when he finished telling me that, he turned to me and he said, but nobody knew what he was really like at home and how he beat me. And all of a sudden, all the story came out about the physical discipline that went on with this young man. So he was in this place of everybody thought one thing and he lived another. And in his grief, how does he ever move beyond the anger of what that created in him? And so in that case, the anger, was not just legitimate. It was, really understood why that piece was there. But then how do you deal with that type of anger where you are feeling that you are not able to express what you really need to say? And it's a very difficult place.
Well, and that's just the kind of situation where individuals in that situation really do need a safe space where they can bring that, because it's been invisible and their pain is invisible, and then it doesn't feel like there's a place in the outer world for that. Yeah.
So anger can be the result of many different things. Right? I think that's an important piece for us to note, that anger is, as you say, Julie, very often a very normal part of the experiences of grief and dying. But it's important for us not to stay in that, not to allow that to be the piece that we simply sit in.
Yeah, I kind of say to clients often, like, it's okay that you have anger, and let's bring it into the room, let's talk about it, let's label it, let's be angry, let's feel it. And then at a certain point, if months and months and months go by and we're still really stuck there, then we probably are getting stuck, right? And so we want to look at that. But there is a period of time where it's quite natural. One of the ways that I see anger manifest so commonly in grief is irritability and low frustration tolerance. And of course, that's just so normal. And part of that is this tremendous cognitive load that we're carrying when we're grieving. Our memory's compromised, our focus, our concentration. We've got this brain fog. And that's just, if you go back to the Mary Frances O'Connor episode on the grieving brain, that's just because your brain's doing so much work. And so it's just really common that it doesn't take much to just kind of fly off the handle kind of moment, because we just don't have this space in us to navigate and move through maybe even just a slightly irritating moment before we find ourselves kind of really flipping our lid. So that's a really common way. And that does last for a really long time, because there's a difference between being, anger in all of this, like I'm lashing out, and between this kind of low grade irritability, low frustration level for a really, that is one that I find can go on for like a year and a half, even when people are really actively grieving.
I've seen too the anger that comes as a natural result of death changing and shaking our perspective of life.
Yes.
So, the things that are important, the things that people value, the things that people argue about or hold on to, when death comes in, suddenly those things aren't important. And then we rub up against people who are, they're upset about something that's absolutely useless in light of what we are just experiencing. We respond in anger.
Yeah, that perspective, right? How our perspective changes when we come up against what seems petty.
Yeah.
Against the greatness of the loss or the gravity of someone's loss, right? There's so much of this, we're talking about anger is justified. And I'm thinking of a gentleman who had a son killed in a car accident and very angry at the driver, which was the other driver, very normal and natural. It, of course, was then tied into the legal system and police and courts. And there was a sense that the anger was driving him to that place of conviction. Someone's going to have to pay because here's a death of someone seemingly stolen, before the time it wasn't. Someone had lived to a proper right old age and died of an illness. And then, the courts make their decisions and it's totally unsatisfying. Mm-hmm. It wasn't enough. Well, could it ever be enough? And we were thinking that maybe that would take the pain away. I think that sense of a conviction is going to take my pain away. And it doesn't. It didn't. And it takes a long time, too. So that anger was driving for a long time, driving that bus. And then left sort of well, what do I do with it now? Because the result is what I was hoping for, but it didn't make me feel any better. And then learning to live with it then. Yeah. And what do I do with it then? I've been carrying it for so long. It's been part of my identity. How do I deal with this anger now? Because all I am left with is cold justice, which doesn't feel enough. And I'm still in my loss. I'm still grieving. And that energy of that anger was what was pushing through. And then when that was over, sort of like the bottom fell out.
Anger pushes most people away from us in terms of support, but in times it also gathers other angry people around us. Mm-hmm. And so what we end up doing is simply, finding ourselves surrounded by other angry people, and we live this anger, which does nothing to help us. Mm-hmm. In a constructive way, does nothing to help us in a health way either. And yet we've kind of pushed away people who may have been there to support us because they just couldn't handle the anger side of things over time. And so we end up then with people around us who are like us. And that's very, very difficult.
Yeah, because they fuel it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very different. That kind of anger is very different from the as I mentioned earlier. I had this wonderful lady who yelled at her husband's ashes all the time, and she knew that she was yelling at him, and she knew she didn't need to yell at the urn, but it got something off of her chest, right?
Right.
And it wasn't the driving force of her day, though. It was like, okay, I got mad at him today. I'm angry. I'm alone, and I'm able to say that. And now I'm going on and living my life and doing my things. That's a very different sort of anger. There's a strange sense of health attached to that, versus that anger that we can get caught up in, that it drives the bus. Yeah. That sort of is what we're living for.
Well, I'm thinking about some of the work the three of us have done with family members where there's been a death by suicide and also overdose death. Mm-hmm. It's very common to hear and feel anger in the room with those folks that sometimes can feel quite different than like the irritability anger that I was just talking about. And often that is very directed out at our systems, because for those people that have died either by suicide or drug overdose, often there has been many, many moments along the way where there have been failures in our systems, in our communities, by other helping people, both formally and, family and friends, where we just couldn't get what that person just couldn't get what they needed. Yep. And that has now resulted in their death.
So can we turn that? Have you found, are we able to kind of pivot that anger from a negative piece to a passionate approach to make the system different? So I think of even like that MAD, that Mothers Against Drunk Driving, originated out of an angry response to that very thing. And I wonder if it's, if that's part of what, in a good way, that we can pivot that anger into a different direction that brings about something healthy and peace.
Yeah. And I think I agree with you. And the part that I would add to that, and this would go for anybody, and I'm not just speaking about drug overdose or suicide here, is that oftentimes there's some real healing work to do beneath the anger, right? And sometimes in some situations, I find the anger is there in the place of shame and guilt, like especially when there's shame and guilt, right? Around really feeling like you've failed your person in some ways. So I feel like if we can use the energy of that anger for activism, as you mentioned, David, yes. And I think that has to go hand in hand at looking at what is, as we talked about, that primary emotions that are sitting beneath the anger, because those need space. Because here's the thing, back to your comment about angry folks, the contagion of that anger, that just leads us down a path that is, as you said, is not healthy for us, right? And that's because there's other emotions driving underneath that we have to get to so we can have healing or at least validation, space, witness of that work so that anger can be used in a healthy way for the activism. Does that?
No, that makes sense. And even as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that, we've got to be careful with that too, because people can turn that energy around into working against the system to prevent that. And as you said earlier, it becomes a distraction from us ever doing the work of our grief too. Mm-hmm. Like we can become just as focused on fixing this thing and never really spend the time with our own pain of saying, okay, yeah, wow, how do I live without this person? What is it doing to me?
Right.
And we can be so focused. And I know people who have taken a death and they've translated their energy into raising funds, mm-hmm. Into doing projects, into doing, all these things. And while they are wonderful and it's been a good energy focus, they've never taken the time. I remember one person I had who 10 years after his young son died, he had thrown himself into everything and kept himself focused on that energy out of that anger of his son. And then it all collapsed. And when he found himself at that moment, 10 years later, he said to me, it's like I'm right back the first day it happened.
Yeah.
Nothing was done to help him along that grief journey.
Because we can't go around it.
You can't go around it. So he used, mm-hmm. and even as good as all of the work was that he had accomplished, it didn't fix the issue of his grief.
We do see that so often, don't we, that people mobilize into action, which can be incredibly meaningful. People organize golf tournaments and baseball tournaments, and they raise money and they start scholarships and they start foundations. And these are wonderful things.
Mm-hmm.
But again, if we're not also finding the space for our grief work through that, yeah, as you were telling your story, I was thinking if someone came to mind that was 20 years later, and there we are doing that grief work. They'd done amazing things to allow that to mobilize, but the grief was all sitting there.
Yeah. I'm sitting here going, it kind of begs the question, when does anger turn from healthy to unhealthy? Or when does anger turn from something that is moving me, helping me move through my grief, to something that is distracting me from my grief, protecting me from my grief, shielding me from my grief? And where's that line? And that's got to be a fine line, and it's probably different for everybody, but we can all see it once we've stepped over it, mm-hmm. Once you look back. Mm-hmm. But at what point can we say, or can we say that that's healthy anger? And that's healthy anger, and it's now starting to sour, or it's starting to turn into something that is hiding or masking that will later need to be untangled because it's doing everything but grieving. It can be, like you guys were saying, it can be very productive, very good, or it could be also very destructive, because people can become depressed and turn to alcohol and drugs, or become sort of lost from their lives and disengaged somehow, and their anger is expressed that way. It's still hiding their grief. So I don't know if there's an answer to this question, but that's, as you guys were talking, I'm thinking, yeah, where's that line? When do we know?
I don't know if we do. That's why I think we have to keep talking. I think that's why that dialogue is ongoing. That's why we have to keep being honest about our anger with someone, and have that ability. Because often the issue is the person that creates the anger in our minds, because they died, they're not here. We can't have a conversation with them to find ways to solve that anger. And I think that's why we have to hopefully have somebody in our life who can sit with us in our anger, not kind of, don't talk to me if you're angry, who can sit with it, as the Buddhists say, a soft belly, strong back. Mm-hmm. I can take what you're saying, I can absorb it, but there's pieces here we have to witness to. I guess the other side of that, of course, and that's the question I would ask, is you raised the issue about anger in a palliative journey where the person is still here, and but we don't want to talk about our anger. But should we? Mm-hmm. Is that something that maybe we can find help in, if we can open up even to the person and say, you're making me, you're making me really angry and mad because you're dying. But at least I get a chance to say it so we can dialogue.
Yeah. And
I don't know.
There's something different about being sitting down and saying calmly and in control, that really angered me. Then in the moment, I'm not going to swear, but like in the moment, the fury and the fire of that anger coming out directed at the person saying, I just want to throttle you. And I mean it. And then, wow, I just got angry with you. You're dying. And now I'm left with my guilt. So I can't live with that. I can't live with that guilt, but I'm so angry at you, but I don't have an ability to express that in a way that I feel like it can be heard. It just comes out knee jerk. It comes out emotional. It comes out hot. It comes out like fire. And then now I've just got angry at that person, and they're the person I love, and now I'm going to be left with my guilt over that. And so I think sometimes in that palliative phase, we can sometimes hold on to some of that anger because we're protecting ourselves from feeling guilty later on, and might not in that sort of compromised emotional space not have the fortitude or the strength to be having that conversation without it becoming hot. Does that make sense? And then that can be a really fine line to walk in the palliative stage.
For someone listening going, okay, so how do I help someone where I'm seeing a lot of anger? I really think it's something as simple as I will often just say, if this person is speaking with a certain tone or, I can feel they're angry, it's palpable, I'll just say, tell me about the anger. And they'll say, what do you mean? And I'm like, I'm feeling anger here. Just tell me about it. I'd like to know more about it. Or, I do a lot of sentence completion with people in my sessions, and I'll say, okay, let's just do a few rounds of this. I'm just going to invite you to anything that comes to mind. And I'll say, I feel angry because she died. I feel angry because she left me with all of this work to do. I feel angry because, and I will just do that until they have listed everything. And I will say, don't hold back, even the most ridiculous things, and we need to voice them and then go, yeah, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. You would be angry about that. And when I do that, if I can take them all the way through many, many, many lines of that, inevitably we land in sadness. And then at some point, I will often see the tears come up, and then I'll say, and I feel sad because she died.
Yeah.
Right? And so the whole point there being just, it needs its space. We need to find a way to tenderly, kindly call it out, which is hard to do when you're feeling people's brittleness, their low frustration tolerance, you can feel it, right? And you can often, it's crackling. And I can often tell somebody, even many years out from the loss, where I know the grief has gotten blocked in some ways, because you can often feel this brittleness in them because they've just been holding it all in. And what you get is this irritability and negativity. It's so common.
That's a great response, Julie, because I think many people, when somebody's angry at them, they respond in anger. So, somebody gets angry with me and I find myself responding angrily back.
Oh, I'm talking here as a therapist, because I don't think that I'm that highly evolved either in the moment, David.
but it is.
I'm better in a therapist mode.
It's better. It's a reality for all of us if we're thinking about how do we handle that. We're not therapists, you say, but that's okay. Be aware of our own emotional response. How are we attuned to what's happening? What's it doing in me? And often the anger can be a trigger, and that just creates more of a problem, because I get triggered when you get angry about something, and then
that's right.
Before you know it, we're in this loop, right?
And that's why families need people outside of the family to support them in a loss, because we just don't have that bandwidth with each other, right? So if you're angry and being snippy and irritable with me, and then I'm feeling defensive with you, I don't have the space in me to be super generous about your anger in that moment. That's why we have to have other supports, other people that we're talking to.
Well, and it's hard to pull yourself out of that when you feel like you are the target of the heat that's being thrown across the kitchen. It's like, oh, what the heck is that?
Yeah.
versus your example where you say, so it's okay to talk about anger. And you are, and when you say that in a therapy session, you might say, well, that sounds like you might have a little bit of anger. That's maybe a little bit expected back and forth between two people. When you're in the kitchen and what are you pissed off about? And then boom, like you said, David, then it comes back with anger. It's a different context, and it's so much harder to keep that in check and keep that under control. And then the fire feeds the fire. And then you find yourself 6 stories higher than you ever thought you were going to be. And then you don't know how to get back down.
And we can't solve anything when we're up there.
Yeah.
And that rational conversational level is where we need to be. But you're right, that anger moves us. And if we respond, before you know it, we're way up.
Yeah.
And this is why relationships become so strained through the grieving process. One of the reasons, not the only reason, but because we have interactions like this. And it's quite common to have many interactions like that are like that. One of the things I was thinking about where anger comes up is with other people as we're grieving. When we're really, really hurting, it's really hard for other people to get it right with what we need, you know? And I was reading this article around a survey that was done with 1,500 grievers. And the survey was looking at, like, once they had sustained a loss, did they look back at the way they had supported people before their loss and have regret about the way that they had supported people? And 98% of people said yes. So that's not a surprise, right? I'm sure all of us in this room have felt that, like, oh gosh, if I had only known how hard this was, I would have been such a better friend to so-and-so, right? But despite that, knowing that, we're still so upset. We can't hold that mentality when we're the one grieving. We just go like, you got it wrong. So it's like, I can't believe you didn't invite me to your Christmas party. I can't believe you invited me to your Christmas party, right?
Yeah.
I can't believe you all got together and went out to the movies and you thought I would want to see such and such a movie. That's so inappropriate. But I can't believe that you did invite me to see that movie. Like, it's sometimes really hard to get it right. You know why? Because nothing feels right. Nothing feels good. And so, yes, sometimes our people just are misattuned to what we need. Absolutely, that happens all the time. But sometimes people just don't know what we need because we don't know what we need. Because when we lose somebody really close to us, it activates our attachment system, which often sends us into this, sometimes what's called attachment panic. We're scared. We're really distressed. And then we're looking for our other attachments to make us feel better, but then nothing makes us feel better. So we don't know what we need. And so people kind of get it wrong a lot of the time. And what we need one day, we need to be asked to the party one day. The next day, we're angry that you asked me to the party. It's a tough go.
It is. It is a very tough go. And I've seen that many, many times. And when you ask people, they say, I know I was angry at people, but I didn't know what I needed, and I don't know why I was angry. I just reacted. The other one I've been thinking of that creates a lot of anger is when people discover secrets or things they didn't know. And often that involves finances or other pieces that after they die and then their spouse or the family discover these things, the anger is just unbelievable.
The betrayal. Yeah, it's such a betrayal. And I think we had talked about even doing an episode on that because all of us have many scenarios where that's happened. And then there's another loss there. Like, did I know this person? Did we have the love I thought we had? Did we have the relationship? But again, that is anger that is being protective. That's a secondary emotion from the anguish of discovering that there's been deceit or...
And in that regard, justified, right? Justified initially, because of course your initial response is going to be what it is.
Yeah.
And it's going to be angry. It's if you can't get over that to the other emotions that lie underneath. So you've got the jet fuel, the energy of those tangled emotions all, exploding. it's taking the time then after to untangle and find out why. And like you said, because I didn't know this one thing about them, did I know them at all? And so, yeah, there's so many places where our anger can be triggered in a scenario of grief. And again, it's that sense of it's justified. In most cases, it's when it takes over or when it becomes something that is the tool for control or the tool for protection, and we hold on to it and that drives. That's when we have to sort of really start to question it. Is this something that is controlling me, or am I controlling it?
So maybe we can have a little compassion with ourselves to recognize anger is not an unnatural response. But then also to move to, how do I deal with my anger? And if I'm somebody who's sitting with somebody in grief, a friend, a family, a colleague, and they are angry, can I sit with that without my anger back? Can we stop that emotional cycle up to the 6th floor? Do I have enough confidence and stability to be able to have calmness in the face of that? And that's very difficult to do because none of us like anger present.
It's very different when there's just anger in the room and when the anger is being directed at you, right? I think many of us can hold space where like, oh, you're angry. Okay, tell me about that. It's very different when all of a sudden the anger is misplaced and it's being projected onto you. And that happens a lot. And I can remember even when I was grieving my father, I was cranky and irritable and short-tempered. My husband's in the room. He's not nodding his head, but he could be. And that went on for a really, really long time. And there was just a negativity about me that now I can just look back and go, oh, I just had no bandwidth. You know, my kids were young. I had a full-time job. His loss was devastating to me. And I was just, and one of the ways my grief really came out was just this, like, so irritable. And it's just so common. And that is such a time when we're all, those of us around people like me at that time, is like trying to give grace to people. It's a lot to ask over and over and over again because it goes on for a long time. But that's the work of those around us who really want to support our people. Yeah. As long as we're not, of course, as long as we're not being abused by that, as long as we're not being, really poorly treated. I'm not talking about that kind of situation. I'm talking about a more normalized grief response.
And I think your experience sort of highlights the fact that if anger or irritability, and it might, sometimes you say, I rarely will start off with the anger. It'll be, wow, that sounded hot. Or that sounded like you might be a little bit irritated. Do you ever get angry? But your story there about your irritability during that time, then sort of brought to my mind, then it's also one of our jobs is to start to become aware of that. And if we're in a grieving response and we find that we're constantly irritable or that we're constantly angry, then if we can catch that, or someone that we love in our environment can catch that and bring that to our attention, because sometimes this is just running under the surface and we're not aware of it. But if we do become aware of it, then we allow ourselves to hopefully maybe try to make other choices and choose other options. So allowing yourself to become aware of it is one of those things that if you're noticing, I'm always angry, sitting down and asking yourself why.
That's where journaling's really helpful. Yeah. Talking to yourself if you're someone who can do that. But yeah, writing it out, trying to find someone to talk to, trying to find a counselor. We really need some space for that. Yeah. So as we bring this episode to a close, any final thoughts or anything on your mind?
Yeah, I'm pretty angry.
Are you?
Don't tell me not to be angry.
No, I'm glad we talked about this because I know it's so common and people, say to me, I find myself just doing road rage and being angry at strangers. And,
I do that all the time.
So
Road rage is
you
so
don't have an
common,
excuse right now,
right?
Red.
Yeah.
But often, they're almost surprised at the anger when it shows up, and they say, "I'm not that normal type of person." So again,
I don't know myself to be like this.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, I would just say, have a little compassion, but as Red said, be aware, and then let's do something about it. Make some choices, because anger is not a nice place to live. It can be a short-term stay, an Airbnb, but it's not a house. It's not a home where you want to live. And finding what you need to do to get that. But death often provokes anger. There's no question. And so maybe we can allow that to be there without judgment, and yet not to be there without work.
Nice.
I was thinking, should I tell people what to do and as opposed to what not to do? But you made me think of the fact that the worst thing you can tell an angry person is don't be angry.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you got someone that's really
It's
angry,
like somebody who's upset saying, calm down.
Yeah, calm. Oh my
That
God!
never works.
You say that, I am now 10 times angrier. Because I don't know. It's because you've called me out, or you are making a judgment about how I'm feeling. Because it's not really anger I'm feeling. Because at the root of all this, and that when you get down to the coals, it is loneliness. It is sadness. It is abandonment. But anyway, try to understand and have compassion for the anger, and come up to it. Maybe that's another sort of signal for the person who might be experiencing some of this anger, is that there's the trigger to say, okay, I'm going to come at this more softly. I'm not going to confront it. Maybe what I'll do is have a little bit of compassion. And I would say, again, just for the person who's angry, if you notice you're being angry and you're angry and irritable all the time, then it's your responsibility at that point to figure it out, because it's not like you can unleash that on everybody, and that's okay. So those would be my final thoughts. Julie Brown?
I think that's a perfect place to leave it. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough, dedicated to providing compassionate care and support to individuals and families facing life-limiting illness and loss. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studio in Peterborough, Ontario. Special thanks to Paradise Garage for providing the music. Technical support is provided by Sean Heichert, and audio engineering by Kevin Fleming. More episodes of What Now are available for free on most major podcast platforms. If you found value in our conversations, please support us by following, leaving a 5-star review, and sharing with your friends and loved ones. If you'd like to support the essential work of Hospice Peterborough, please consider visiting hospicepeterborough.org/donate. Your contribution helps us to continue to provide vital care and support. Until next time, may you find peace and comfort on your journey.